The days blurred into one another after that eerie night when I found my father standing alone in the living room, clutching the bottle and muttering to himself. His eyes had been so wild, so unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I couldn't shake the image from my mind, and the more I tried to push it away, the more it haunted me. There was something deeply wrong, something I couldn't quite grasp, but I knew this was only the beginning. I started avoiding the house as much as I could. My husband noticed it first. Every time I'd come home from work, I'd stay in the driveway, just sitting there, reluctant to step inside. I hated it. I hated feeling like a stranger in my own home. But how could I face him? How could I deal with this man who was slowly tearing us apart? I began staying out late, often driving aimlessly through the city just to avoid coming back to the suffocating atmosphere. One evening, I pulled into a parking lot overlooking the river and sat there for hours, staring at the water. My mind was restless, churning with 1,000 thoughts that wouldn't settle. That's when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. She rarely called anymore. Our conversations had become fewer as the weight of my father's presence bore down on us. "Can you come home?" Her voice was thin, strained, as if she was barely holding herself together. "What happened?" I asked, my heart pounding. "It's your father," she whispered, almost afraid to say more. "He's acting strange again. He's been pacing around the house all night, saying things I can't understand." I'm scared. A wave of dread washed over me. I knew something was coming, something dark and terrible. I couldn't avoid it any longer. My family was slipping further into chaos, and I had no choice but to confront it. When I pulled into the driveway that night, I saw the lights were on in the living room, flickering faintly through the curtains. The house loomed before me, a shadow of what it once was. I stepped out of the car, my body tense with anxiety, and made my way to the front door. The moment I opened it, the air hit me. It was thick, oppressive, like something unseen was pushing down on the house. I heard voices as I stepped inside. My father's voice, loud and frantic, filled the room. He was talking to himself again, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His words were disjointed, rambling, making no sense at all. "Why won't they listen? Why won't they let me leave?" he muttered, his hands shaking. "They keep watching me, always watching." My mother was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale and gaunt. She looked up at me as I entered, her eyes wide with fear. "He won't stop," she said in a trembling voice. "He's been like this for hours." I stepped closer, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Dad," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on? Who's watching you?" He stopped pacing and turned to face me. His eyes, bloodshot and full of a manic intensity, bore into mine. For a moment, I didn't recognize him at all. It was as if the man standing before me wasn't my father anymore, but a hollow shell filled with something darker. "They're always there," he said, pointing wildly at the window. "Out there, watching, waiting for me to slip. They don't want me to leave, but I have to. I have to get away from them." I exchanged a glance with my mother. This was getting worse. Every day he was becoming more unhinged, unraveling before our eyes. "Dad," I said gently, "no one is watching you. There's no one outside." But he wasn't listening. His gaze shifted back to the window, and he started pacing again, his voice growing louder. "They're always here," he shouted, gripping his hair in frustration. I can't get away from them. They're controlling everything. My mother let out a soft sob, and I rushed over to her side, holding her tightly. She was trembling, her body shaking with fear. I don't know what to do, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to help him. Neither did I. The man standing before us was a stranger, and whatever had taken hold of him was pulling him deeper into a place we couldn't reach. The next morning, I decided to confront him. I had to try anything to get through to him. I found him in the kitchen, staring blankly at the counter, his hands shaking as he fumbled with a cup of coffee. "Dad," I said softly, approaching him cautiously. "We need to talk." He didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the counter, his hands trembling as if he were holding onto something invisible, something only he could see. "Dad, please," I urged. "You need help. We can't go on like this." He finally looked up at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach drop. There was no recognition, no warmth, no familiarity. It was as if the man I had known my whole life had been swallowed up by something darker. "I don't need help," he said flatly. "I just need to leave." "Leave? Where would you go?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You can't just keep running away. You need to face this. We can help you, but you have to let us in." His gaze darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he just turned away, walking out of the kitchen without another word. The days passed, each one more unbearable than the last. My father's behavior became more erratic, more unpredictable. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning in the middle of the night, smelling of alcohol and cigarette smoke. He wouldn't speak to us, wouldn't even acknowledge our presence. He was living in his own world, a world where we didn't exist. One evening I decided to follow him. I had to know where he was going, what he was doing. I couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. He left the house around 8 p.m., and I waited a few minutes before slipping out behind him. He walked quickly, his head down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I kept my distance, staying in the shadows, afraid that if he saw me, he'd confront me in a way I wasn't prepared for. He made his way through the neighborhood, walking with purpose, as if he had somewhere specific in mind. I followed him through the streets, past the dimly lit houses, my heart pounding in my chest. After about 20 minutes, he turned a corner and disappeared into an alleyway. I hesitated for a moment, fear gripping me. But I had come this far, and I wasn't going to back down now. I followed him into the alley, staying close to the walls, trying to keep out of sight. At the end of the alley, there was a small bar. The neon sign flickered above the door, casting a sickly green glow over the entrance. My father slipped inside, and I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I follow him in? Should I confront him? What was he doing here? I took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing the door open. The bar was dark and crowded, filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. I scanned the room, my eyes searching for him, but I couldn't see him anywhere. I felt a knot of dread form in my stomach. Where had he gone? And then I saw him. He was sitting at a table in the corner, talking to someone. A woman. She was laughing, leaning in close to him, her hand resting on his arm. A surge of anger and betrayal shot through me. After everything he had put us through, after all the lies and the pain, he was here with her. I turned and left the bar, my heart racing, tears stinging my eyes. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep watching him destroy our family. That night, When he came home, I confronted him. Who was she? I demanded, standing in the hallway as he walked through the door. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. What are you talking about? I saw you, I said, my voice trembling with anger. At the bar. I saw you with her. His face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then he just shrugged, as if it didn't matter. So what? He said. What does it matter to you? It matters because you're destroying us. I shouted. You're tearing this family apart, and for what? For her? For some woman you barely know? He didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. Get out, I whispered, my voice shaking. Just get out. He didn't move. I said get out. I screamed, my hands shaking with rage. I don't care where you go, just leave. You can't stay here anymore. For a moment he just stood there, staring at me with that same cold, emotionless expression. Then he turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. I stood there, my heart racing, tears streaming down my face. This was it. This was the end. Or so I thought. But the nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning.